Greetings, friends. Operational situation at the front on the 8th of February. Let's take a closer look at the Kapitsko-Lemensky section of the front, the Bakhmut direction, and the Avdiivka direction. And let's start, of course, with the Skabinsko-Lemensky section. So, in the area of Sinkovka and AVDEEVKA, without any significant changes, the positional nature of the fighting continues. While the vector of the enemy is changing a little from the AVDEEVKA area, as we talked about on previous broadcasts. But today more detailed information has appeared. It means that the enemy is preparing to attack positions southwest of Kotlyárovka, as we talked about earlier on previous broadcasts, that one of the supports, large enough, is quite an important goal for the enemy, which would allow him to naturally gain advantageous positions, dig in and increase pressure both north of AVDEEVKA, and to carry out the same, what they were talking about, the environment of Kislovka-Kotlyárovka, due to the fact that they will break through between AVDEEVKA and Kislovka. But it's too early to talk about this anyway, and the passage between AVDEEVKA-Kislovka looks quite strange in general, what was voiced. Naturally, there will be a lot of misinformation on their part in order to confuse, but the fact that the pressure is being increased precisely on the support area between Kotlyárovka and AVDEEVKA is there. And now the enemy is pulling up additional forces in order to try to improve their tactical positions. On this particular sector of the front, well, it's natural that the main goal is not to pull troops from the west of AVDEEVKA, but to align the front line by taking two villages of Kislovka-Kotlyárovka. Therefore, the fighting continues. To date, they have a positional character, but the enemy is preparing to strike at this sector of the front, in this direction, between AVDEEVKA and Kotlyárovka. Lyman direction. It means that active military operations are continuing in eastern Terno, in eastern Yampolovka. Counterattacks were observed from the AFU. The footage was published today. It means that the active combat zone is not only gray, but it also remains red, because according to the footage that was published, it means that there is a partial success. Russian troops were pushed back to the eastern part, from the central eastern part of Yar-Laptev, but then they launched attacks again, so the situation remains for further clarification. But according to the frames, it will most likely be, if we have a gray zone that is still fresh from this area, we need more additional ones. Nevertheless, the enemy does not abandon attempts to break through to the Thorns and the Yampolovka as a whole in this sector of the front. Activity is also observed in the direction of Torsky, but it has a positional character. We do not record any new changes in Bologorovka. Now the main task of the Russian troops is, of course, to transfer additional forces to the territory of the substation and, of course, having already formed a strike group on this bridgehead, attack in the direction, as our fighters report from the field, in the direction of the chalk quarry, that is, with larger forces than were involved. Although in general, it must be said that they attacked here, with the support of armored vehicles. There were reports, up to 20 armored vehicles were involved. There were also attacks north of Bologorovka. New footage was published from the Gray Zone, where again Russian troops attacked. Active military operations are continuing in this sector of the front. And I repeat, the enemy is now aiming very seriously at Bologorovka, so it is pulling up additional forces to increase pressure on this sector of the front. In the Bakhmut direction, the main military operations are still taking place. I will not say that between Ivanovo and Kleshivka, but as I wrote in my telegram yesterday in this morning's summary, I further inform you that north-south of the road section of the highway T0504, that is, there is very much activity. The enemy is approximately in this area, which is north of the road, and is quite high approximately in this area of the gray zone. The main task was not to cling to it as before, to go and cling to the outskirts of Ivanovo, as reported directly by the soldiers of the 93rd Brigade, and then they knocked out during the fighting, did not allow the Russian troops to gain a foothold. Now the main goal of the enemy is to approach Ivanovskoye with the widest possible coverage, and, accordingly, to try a more massive attack on the settlement itself. Why are attacks coming from the area of the Garden Association and the territory of the abandoned airfield in the northwestern direction, but the main goal is to gain a foothold along the forest belts. And similarly, we have a trap for Bakhmut himself. That is, to break through along several forest belts, to gain a foothold, to approach the Ivanovo as much as possible, including the cascade of stakes. There is also an area where you can get a foothold. Therefore, he also has a bet on this area, on the part of the enemy. We continue active military operations with a wide coverage in this area. As for the Kleshivka and AVDEEVKA, positional nature of the fighting without any changes. Well, we turn to the AVDEEVKA direction. In the north, let's start right from Gorlovka. Gorlovka, New York. I even jumped to AVDEEVKA. There, active hostilities continue at an abandoned gas substation. You may remember that we commented on this moment back in late January. So there was a counterattack by the defense forces. It was partially knocked out. Then, we moved one of the supports to the gray zone, near the substation itself, on the territory of the substation itself. It means that active hostilities have already been going on for more than 10 days. Russian troops are trying to stabilize the situation, of course, to dislodge the APU from this area and restore this point, which has been under their control for about 10 years. That is, the formation of the DPOE, we say, and so on, for the entire period. And accordingly, the main task now is to restore this line again, but we do not fix any changes, except that the enemy is pulling up forces, but he does not succeed in this area. By the way, it is necessary to add together to this position of our APU that the enemy has published new, fresh, confirming footage. By the way, this is the second time we have already had a case when they approach Gorlovka, and let's say, the Russian troops are not ready, and the DPOE troops are not ready to repel attacks. Naturally, now they will try to stabilize the situation, and most likely they will stabilize it, as it was in the area of the landfill. In the area of a number of positions near the landfill to the north, the southeastern landfill. But in any case, their defense shows a second case of subsidence in Gorlovka. There is such a moment. Naturally, you are fussing from the outside. The actions are aimed, among other things, at distorting the Russian troops. Why? Because, I will tell you about it at the end, already on AVDEEVKA. Very important news. Along AVDEEVKA itself, it means that the northern flank of the positional nature of the fighting in the area of the railway tracks, it means that at the intersection, without any changes in the positional nature of the fighting in the Stepovoy area, well, we proceed to active hostilities. This is north of AVDEEVKA and its northern part. It means that the pressure on the Garden Association continues from the area of treatment facilities. Active hostilities are taking place in this area of the gray zone today. Or rather, not even for today, but for the morning. We still need to make such an adjustment in order to understand a more objective picture. It means that the enemy is actively advancing in this area. His main task has already been announced, is to break through to the dachas, to the Garden Association, and the surrender is already the most improbable attempt to get to the log complex or to the carpool. The DNA gas station, well, actually the area that we noted yesterday, active military operations. So, as you have noticed, there is some adjustment. I did not display it in a separate message anymore, only the red zone was slightly expanded. Now let's talk about this in more detail. So, within the gray zone beyond Chistyakov Street, there are assault actions of Russian troops, aimed just the same, at catching on, and gaining a foothold on the territory of dachas. Naturally, the railway is now more of an advantage for us, because aerial reconnaissance and the weather is good, sees perfectly the actions of the Russian troops. Nevertheless, there are oddities that are reported by the fighters themselves. And this strangeness was due to the fact that the Starling speed dropped. This is the first moment, and the second moment is that the Russian fighters had a Starling and moreover, the official versions are not something that was captured. It's not that they are there in some roundabout ways, it's like it is reported. Well, for now let's leave it at the level of messages. They buy the official version in Dubai, well, and it works on their official firmware. They say that they complain that this is the action of Elon Musk. In any case, look, we will leave these messages, but only the reliable fact that the speed of Starlink on our side has fallen. We emphasize as a fact. Because the fighters complain and show the speed that they have now. Therefore, it is very difficult to work. Perhaps the enemy naturally has electronic warfare systems. I do not rule out that this may be just the same their work is aimed at, but in any case, it is there. Therefore, there are a number of difficulties. We are talking about the effectiveness of naturally aerial reconnaissance, but now there are some problems with it. This also needs to be taken into account. There is such a moment. Therefore, active military operations on two garden associations continue within the gray zone with varying success. The situation remains dynamic. At the same time, the enemy is not only aimed at this section of the front, but also to maximize the bridgehead between Sapranova Street, Persha Travneva Street, that is, the gray zone, to stabilize the protrusion of the gray zone as much as possible, and, accordingly, to gain a foothold as much as possible on this section of the front, that is, in the northern part of AVDEEVKA. Naturally, it will not be so easy to knock him out. The more he advances, the situation is clear. Well, actually, I think you generally understand the situation that is happening here. Well, we had some more adjustments in the area of the Blue Lakes sand quarry. There is also some enemy activity here. It is aimed naturally now at cutting off another protrusion of the gray zone, catching on and stabilizing it. So to speak, align the front line and attack with a wider coverage. Now with regard to, as I said for Gorlovka, the reserves of why Russian troops are now important. It is very important to distort. Because yesterday, we had a number of messages from quite reputable centers that, in fact, it is now difficult to talk about stabilization in AVDEEVKA. Why? Because the enemy did not use their main forces. Yes, about 60 to 70% of the forces are reportedly in a dormant state, but they are not tightened up by the one that I emphasized to you the last broadcasts, that they pulled up as much as possible from a distance of about 40 kilometers from the pounds. In other words, this is Donetsk, these are settlements scattered in the AVDEEVKA direction, and, accordingly, they are waiting for their time. Therefore, it is difficult to talk about anything here, because the enemy has a total advantage in manpower. In any case, we will talk, and in artillery. Therefore, these are not only my words, because you start writing a lot, that I am almost spreading it for the Rado. Today there was also a message, in the Monaco battalion, a rather patriotic public. There was an article for the Street Journal, comments by one of our commanders directly from AVDEEVKA, who also reports that the front may collapse, and there the enemy may really enter the operational space. This is precisely due to the fact that he pulled up large reserves. This is a very, very large number. I repeat, the enemy at least has an active assault. It is about 60% of stormtroopers. In other words, we say October, November, December, January and February assault operations in AVDEEVKA. But he did not use his main forces. In other words, there is still a lot of work ahead on our part. And naturally, the enemy, having tightened these reserves, will definitely enter the battle at some stage. Therefore, active hostilities continue. Our main stake, of course, is on the northern flank and north of AVDEEVKA. I repeat, align the front line now along the two projections of the gray zone. Well, the garden associations mean that fierce battles are taking place now, without exaggeration fierce. The heaviest battles are going on in this area. Plus, our Telegram channels, and that's where I'll finish. Let's go further. They published at night that there were a lot of bombings with aerial bombs, half-trucks. 1.5 toners were dropped on AVDEEVKA and posted videos even from Donetsk, from local residents, who reported that they were all cowering there, a shock wave, and it was dozens of blows, and as our fighters reported from the field, the enemy dropped about a week's norm for tonight. Therefore, it is extremely difficult to act now, and you must understand as much as possible the situation that also exists in this area. Guys, do everything that is possible and impossible. As it will be, so it will be. Someone complains about the problems that were in the period of AVDEEVKA, and he is probably right. Why did I say that when the breakthrough began, that Butusev just did not exaggerate in this case, he did not escalate, and was telling the truth, because, well, there was a problem there, and alas, he was completely right. We moved to the south of AVDEEVKA. Our activity in the area of the Tsarskaya Okhota complex continues, as well as along the streets mentioned earlier on previous broadcasts of the same sports, Chernyshevsky and Sobornaya. We do not record any new changes in this sector of the front. The enemy here is attempting assault actions in different directions, that is, it is a street, a lane, or rather Sadovo, Lesnaya Street in this direction, from the area of the Tsarskaya Okhota complex in the north direction, from the area of the Dubrava Garden Association, in the area of the Garden Association, they have a positional character, so there is relative stabilization here, but now everything depends on of the north. And the stabilization of the south can on our part neutralize what is happening in the north. Rather, the north can neutralize what is happening in the south. It's more correct this way. As for the experienced one, there are also attacks from the experienced area. They are in order to disperse our forces, of course. There are attacks not only in order to bypass a number of fortified areas in the direction of the Garden Association, in the direction of the south of AVDEEVKA, that is, according to this vector northeast, but also north of the most experienced. There is some activity, it is possible to restrain, but the enemy is now increasing pressure, it also needs to be understood. And we say the information for the morning. This is also very important to emphasize. May Day. There are assault actions on the part of the enemy. They are not only at Pervomaysky itself. Yesterday we commented and added some clarifications of the red zone at the T-shaped intersection, but I repeat, these were clarifications, there was about a month and a half, but alas, they were yes. The enemy does not reduce pressure here either, makes further attempts to advance with armored vehicles, improve tactical positions. Videos of the destruction of 2 tanks in approximately this area were published from our side. I mean, what does that say? That the enemy is further making attempts, what we talked about, to align the front line of Vodien, Pervomaysk and east of Nevelsky, that is, along this line. Therefore, the activity is quite high east of Nevelsky. We still have. We turn to the Kurikovsky direction of Georgievka. On the part of the enemy, it means that the footage, as you remember, of active hostilities in the trap of complexes of the temple territory was published. On our side, new personnel appeared, and, unfortunately, he managed to advance a considerable distance. If we talk about the previous periods of defeat, the fire damage was inflicted in one of the houses. And in total, the enemy's advance to date has amounted to up to 280 meters on the front line, to a depth of up to 390 meters in a westerly direction. The situation at the site is still under further clarification because active hostilities continue in this sector of the front. To all this, add activity along the forest belts, what we noted on previous broadcasts, that is, activity in this area remains quite high, so there is active combat work. And in a number of areas, the situation is dynamic, it is possible to discard somewhere, but as we see, the enemy does not give up trying to break through in the eastern part of Georgievka, or it is easier to get north of the Georgievka rate. As for the south of the Georgievsky Stavka, there is activity on the part of the enemy, but it is possible to repel and restrain these attacks, not allowing them to advance. But the activity is quite high. As for the victory, a number of opponents have published a promotion. Someone reports top clarifications. Someone reports that these are old frames. It means that there was an attempt by Russian troops along the route 00532 to advance in a southwesterly direction. They reached one of the structures near the abandoned field reservoir. Then the APU inflicted a fire defeat and the enemy retreated to their original positions. Therefore, here we do not record progress, but activity is actually not only in the direction of victory, and in the direction of one of the mainstays. They do not give up trying, and now, at the expense of just the same artillery and tactical aviation, they are increasing pressure on this section of the front. There is such a moment. Active fighting continues in the South Donetsk sector of the Novomikhailivka front in its southeastern part. There were reports that the enemy managed to advance and gain a foothold in a number of houses in Novomikhailivka. Active work is underway now on the part of the APU and counterattacks in order to knock out the enemy. If not to their original positions, of course, then at least to throw them to the outskirts from the settlement itself. The enemy, as we have already said, faced a number of difficulties, which he actually complained about himself, but it is too early to say that there will be stabilization now, because he is pulling up forces and sufficiently combat-ready, based on the fact that the Far East is here again. The Marines were transferred who have combat experience. An unsuccessful one should be emphasized under Ugledar, but still they have this combat experience, so they are now conducting assault operations. And of course, those brigades that were involved earlier are attacking on this sector of the front, including positions north of Novomikhailivka near the fortifications, but they have a positional character. The main goal is naturally to expand the zone of active offensive, that is, to pull up your troops further south. But the APU is also actively working, including a counter-battery, as far as possible under the current conditions. Who knows? He understood what I was talking about. Well, of course, the activity of drones is also quite high in this sector of the front. In the Ugledar direction without any changes. Veliko-Novoselkovskaya, Orakovskaya, and Kherson directions without significant changes. That's the situation we have. I repeat, this is the situation for the morning. We need to emphasize, because the situation is quite dynamic now, and we have very serious active hostilities on the Bakhmut, AVDEEVKA, and Yuzhnodotsky sectors of the front. Until the evening broadcast, be healthy. Glory to the chosen Psalm of Ukraine.